That was a bit of Verdi's Requiem. Wow, what an amazing piece that is to play. We did that a few weeks ago with the orchestra, and it's always just such a privilege to get to play that trombone part. Another great piece that we did last week was Mozart's Requiem, and I'm going to post a little excerpt of me playing some of the alto trombone part from that piece at the end of this video. But both of those are masterworks and just really rewarding and fun to play on trombone. And while we were playing these pieces, I was thinking a lot about working on focusing myself on letting go, on playing with conviction and certainty. That's the flip side of that would be to hesitate, to hold back. But I was specifically focusing on how ISTDP and some of these concepts can help with this, to help with letting go, playing with conviction. And I think that both the Verdi and the Mozart can really tempt you to be a little cautious or to hesitate, and kind of for different reasons. With the Verdi, you have these really long stretches where you're not doing anything. You're just sitting listening to the soloists. And then suddenly you have to come in sometimes with something quite loud, or sometimes also just a little gentle, maybe even just a note or some kind of little figure. So that can really cause this kind of hesitation if you're sitting there waiting to come in and then you're not really sure, and then you are overly careful with it. Mozart's kind of the opposite, because you play the whole time. In fact, when I play, I'm usually grateful for a couple of those sections that you're off, just to have a break on your face. It's more like playing, or what I would imagine is like playing lead trumpet in a big band. It's just you're always prominent, you're often very high and exposed. And that can cause one to be really overly cautious for a different reason, just because you're really putting yourself out there. So what can get in the way? What can make you hesitate? What can make you hold back? What does that come from? And what I think, I mean, it could be a variety of things, but here's one thing that I think could be really helpful, and that also really anyone can start to pay attention to and work on and improve on. And this is the concept of conflicting ways of thinking, conflicting desires, and conflicting interests in your mind. And I would narrow it down to two main categories of things: what your ego wants and what your superego wants. And I'll go through a little bit of what those are. And I'm using, I guess you would say, the Freudian definitions of those. Ego these days is something you talk about like the really arrogant, like I'm the best and no one can play like me and I'm king of the world, that kind of thing. But that's not how I'm really using ego. In this context, I'm talking about ego as more like my desires, my feelings, my thoughts, my intentions about the music, what I want, kind of my heart. The superego is more like how I fit in to the orchestra, how I fit into the world. So I'll give you just a few examples of ego versus superego. And one thing I want to stress is that these are not parts of the brain. A brain surgeon could not go into your head and remove your superego. It's not like an actual part of your brain, as much as it is just a thought process, a way of thinking. And both of them are really important. Here's an example. Let's say you have the two little kids in a sandbox, Stevie and Tony. And let's say that Stevie accidentally hits Tony with a shovel. And right away, instantly, without any kind of thought, it's very likely that little Tony is going to feel angry that Stevie hit him with a shovel and immediately whack him with his little shovel. So at that age, they don't really have a developed superego. But what happens is over time, you develop this superego that helps to control and helps you to fit into society or your culture or your workplace or your community, your family. It kind of keeps you in line. And both of these processes are things that try to help you. Another example with adults would be, let's say that you found a wallet on the street and a lot of money in it. And let's also say, hypothetically, that you really were going through a tough time financially. You had something coming up you really needed to pay for, you didn't have the money for. So the ego part of you would say, oh man, I could just keep this money. It would help me so much, and this would be really great. And the superego's like, but it's not the right thing to do. If you lost your wallet, you sure would like to have that money back, and you don't really know that other person's story. So you can see you have these conflicts, and both of them are trying to help you in a way, because the ego is trying to help you get money which you need to survive, and the superego is trying to help you to keep from, I don't know, getting in trouble or feeling bad about yourself, being a good person, those kinds of things. And it's not always that the ego's bad and the superego's like the more moral one. It can also be reversed in some instances. Just to give you an example, like my grandmother used to tell me the story about my great-grandfather. I never knew him. This was like 100 years ago. That when he would travel on business, he was a really successful businessman, and he used to travel a lot. But when he would travel, sometimes when homeless people would come up and ask him for help, for money, he'd say, hey, let's go get some lunch. And he'd go and have lunch with homeless people. And he felt like buying them some lunch and some coffee and sitting there and talking and listening to their story and maybe giving them some encouragement would make a big difference. Now, when I hear that story, the part of my thought process, the ego, is like, wow, that's a really compassionate, kind thing to do. And for me, my superego, that process, it just goes completely insane. It's like, oh my God, that is so dangerous. Like, what if that person is crazy and they pulled a knife out on you? And what if they wouldn't go away? You bought them lunch and they followed you to the hotel. I mean, I would have all these ideas about you should not do that. So it's not so cut and dry as one is always this kind of bad instinct, and the superego is always kind of keeping it in check. Sometimes it can be a little bit flipped around too. Anyway, I hope that gives you an idea of what I'm talking about with ego and superego. Now, in terms of playing music, which is what I really want to talk about in this video, the ego is your feelings about the piece, what your intentions are, what you really want to do with a piece of music. It can be your ideas about phrasing. It can be the ideas about sound. It can be anything you want to say musically, your intention. All of these come from your this part of yourself we're calling the ego. So for example, with the Verdi, when I see that, it's such a dramatic piece, and the markings on the music, there are always lots of accents. Often it's fortissimo or even more, and it's like that sense of drama and excitement that I really want to bring to the piece. So the superego has to do with fitting that into the orchestra, fitting that in also into the conductor's wishes, because it can change a little bit each week depending on what you're asked to do. So what happens is when you have the part of your brain process, the ego, urging something, and then you have the superego, on the other hand, urging something else, that can cause this kind of conflict. And then you can get tied up. And this goes back to my original point about hesitating and holding back. So if you, for instance, let's say that, this is the example I just talked about. Let's say in the Verdi, you have a big entrance coming, and you can see it's loud, and the part of you that's your ego is just saying, I really want to give this, I really want to put this out there, and I really want to go for it and make this really exciting and dramatic. And then the superego is saying, the conductor really wanted me to be a little more, not quite as aggressive in that area, and also I need to make sure that I'm balancing my colleagues here in the back row. So that's kind of an example, typical example that might come up in the Verdi. And so how do you resolve that? How do you get through that? The first step is to actually see those competing different interests. And that is something I think anybody can do. I try to give this disclaimer in every video, but I'm not a doctor, I'm not a medical doctor, I'm a trombone player, I'm a professional musician. So I'm giving these bits of advice in the context of what I do with my job, and they help me, and I'm hoping they might help you too. But the first step is just to see the different thought processes. And this is something you can do in the practice room. Some of these videos are really focused on what you're doing on stage, what you're thinking during a performance. But this one, I think the bulk of it happens in practice and rehearsal. And so when you're working on a piece of music, to balance out how you feel, what you really want to do with a piece of music from the bottom of your heart, as opposed to how you know it should be played. And should is kind of the key word. If it's you should do this, that's pretty much an alert that you're dealing with something coming from the superego thought process. Because should means it's telling you how to fit in to the orchestra, or tell how to fit into the world, how to it gives the balance and possibly elegance and polish to things. So the bit I'm going to play in a moment for you from the Mozart is a different ball of wax, because the Verdi is so dramatic, and so yeah, it has this powerful kind of quality, whereas the Mozart is much more refined and elegant. So as I think I mentioned in my video about The Critic, where I played some Mozart, Mozart for me is the one that has the most, what would I say? The superego is most watchful or most involved with that. Now, once you've noticed those competing interests and those competing thought processes, after that, what you do is you have to come to some kind of balance, some kind of negotiation, some kind of situation where both sides get to have their say. And it's really important, because if you just play only with too much of this ego thought process, then it can get kind of raw and it can get uninformed, and you can do things like not play with your colleagues because you're so interested in just doing your thing that you don't pay attention and play with the other people around you. Or you can do something really way out of style. You know, maybe you think, this is so dramatic, and then you listen to it later, and that really was not in the right style of what I was supposed to do. Too much superego can make it super boring. If you're just playing exactly what you should do, and you've got, everything's in tune, and it's perfectly in balance with the trumpet, and that you're playing with her beside you, and the conductor is pleased with it, but it's like super boring. So to have both of those, what that frees you up when you can get to that point where you've sort of negotiated those two competing interests and come to some kind of solution, that allows you to let go, because both of those parts of you can accept it. So what I would leave you with is just this, not really an exercise, but something to maybe start thinking about, is to start noticing those different interests in your practice, to see when your ego really would like something to happen with the music, and the superego perhaps has a different idea of how that should go. And if you can come to some kind of agreement, because once you get satisfied, where it's like, you know what, like with the Verdi example I used, this is fortissimo, it should be dramatic, and and you get together, you notice the should in there, you have this kind of coming together where it balances all your competing interests as a person, and then you'll find yourself playing with more conviction, letting go, and really going for it, because you don't have this internal conflict as much. You've kind of worked it out. And the other thing I really like about this is it can also reveal to you what you need to practice. Because let's say, for instance, that you really, from the bottom of your heart, would like the Verdi to be really dramatic and strong. But you realize that when you play it, it's like you're not getting a sound that's appropriate. You know that that's not like an orchestral sound. Then that informs you that it's actually something you need to practice. So, and then once you get to the point that you can play with the sound you'd like to, both in terms of your ego and your superego, then you develop as a musician, which is what we all want, right? So anyway, I'm going to finish here with a little bit of an excerpt from Mozart, and hope you enjoy it, and hope this is helpful, and thanks for watching.